Welcome back. I hope that you all had a great lunch break. Maybe you got to check out the NATO EU game, who's winning there. Maybe you got to network with one another a little bit or reflect on the presentations and speakers that we've heard so far. We have a very engaging afternoon session in store for you, starting with some compelling personal stories about the fight against climate change. Climate change is not just a threat to humans and life on Earth. It's a threat multiplier, which means it has the potential to exacerbate other threats and drivers of instability, contributing to greater security risks. In other words, climate change can make a bad situation worse through things like drought, desertification, famine, and more. NATO has put tackling the security effects of climate change at the heart of its forward-looking agenda, because young people today are set to suffer more from climate change effects than any previous generation. We also know that, as in war, women and children are disproportionately more affected and bear the brunt of the negative impacts of climate change. But unlike many security threats, this one is truly global, and it will require more cooperation and collaboration than confrontation. So it's now my pleasure to hand the stage over to our moderator for the next session, Matthew Pye, who is the founder of the Climate Academy. Matthew will also introduce the panelists for this session. So please give a round of applause for Matthew.
Okay, welcome everybody. Actually, normally on a Monday, I'm just over the road in the European school teaching philosophy. So this is sitting down in chairs and hosting things and doing dialogues and question and answers is not such a strange experience. I have with me Adélaïde and Rahmina, and they'll do short introductions in a moment. I just want to introduce the topic, and that is how climate change impacted my life, their life, and of course our own. We'll have questions through from the online people and also here in the room, just like in the other sessions. So, first of all, Adélaïde, could you introduce yourself and tell us how climate impacted you?
Yes, hi everyone, it's great to be here. I'm Adélaïde, I'm a 22-year-old climate and human rights activist from Belgium. And clearly the climate emergency has changed my life. I've always known that we were facing climate change, but I mean, so what? I'm a student, I'm in schools, probably the adults are handling it because obviously my job as a student is just to do my homework. But I quickly realized that it was much deeper than what I heard, that actually I was not getting that much information at school. And thanks to amazing figures such as Greta and many others that started using new tools like social medias, I was able to get a deeper understanding and most importantly, not only understanding of what climate emergency is, but what you can actually do about it when you are just a student, when you are so young and you don't necessarily have a special role in society, but you still have a responsibility. And I think since then, and that was like 5 years ago, my life completely changed because my priority didn't become my homework anymore, but became the activism, became the idea of being an engaged citizen. And at that moment, it didn't mean going to school, it meant going striking, to call out to leaders, to my parents, to adults on the fact that we are not handling this crisis. And so since the past 5 years, and since I realized the emergency of climate change, my life has completely changed because my priorities have completely changed, and I decided to become an engaged citizen.
Fantastic. And Rahmina?
Okay, so my name is Rahmina Paullete. I am a climate activist, a 17-year-old environmentalist from all the way Kenya. And I think really when people speak about climate change, it really touches my heart because I'm one of the climate migrants that managed to survive an ordeal of floods during years back when I was 5 years old in Fangano Island. We had to leave the island to go to the other land, the mainland, which is really far away from the place that I used to call home. So whenever I speak about the thing that happened, it's really in touch with realities. It is happening in most of these African countries in this continent and even in Asia. So with me, when people say that the climate crisis is a joke, I don't take it as a joke because I live in it. I suffer the impacts of the climate crisis. That's why I said I need to change this. It doesn't matter even if I haven't learned about it. It matters that I have to take action because it's happening in my home, in my country, and how will this really impact the societies? I mean, with the Lake Victoria community, we've suffered a lot, but there's no attention that is being paid for the lakes. All people think about the oceans, but don't really remember about the lake. There are many people, even in Lake Victoria, we have more than 30 million people across East African region that depends on it for an economic revenue at the same time as a way of connecting with culture. As I am the girl from the lake, Lake Victoria, a place where people really connected to the roots of the Luo culture, where we fish for a living, we swim in the lake, but right now, because of the climate crisis, we cannot leave that possibly doing the same thing that we used to do. Like my younger brother, he doesn't know the struggles that we went through. What he doesn't know is that the lake holds a greater impact to our own society, has a good history for us. But now, because of the climate catastrophe, we cannot engage in such activities, which is really sad.
So I think you speak very powerfully, and the fact is that you represent here the actual material impact in the present of it. And when you're 5 years old, you were made a refugee, and there was a loss then of your ancestry, of your culture. Maybe you're talking around Christmas time about certain fish which are no longer available. And so we have on stage here with these two women the material current present impact. And the funny thing, and this is the paradox of climate change, is that the reality of it in a way is so abstract. So as a philosophy teacher, I'm always in a way navigating between these two things, between the highly abstract and the ideals or the ideas and the actual material experience. So I think what I want to say as a teacher here is that the reason for myself, what I've been doing for the last, this is my short introduction, I found out about the climate crisis by chance. I just went to a talk by a famous cultural figure, Michael Wadley, in 2011, and I thought I was green. I thought I kind of knew the basics about what the environment was, but it just hit me like a brick. I just was so shocked, first of all, by the data, and I'll come to that in a second, but then by the fact that I only found it out by chance. So as a teacher in a school, for me to find out that material late in my career, in a way, you kind of think of yourself as relatively cultured as a philosophy teacher in a European school sort of thing, to be so, in a way, humiliated by the data, that was the first shock. But then the second shock was, well, what about everybody else? What about all the children that I'm teaching? What about all students across the world? And education is failing on climate, like seriously failing. So that's why I started the Climate Academy, which we'll get to later. So just as a little image, I have, I don't know if I push. Yeah, so this is a sculpture which I saw 30 years ago in Durham, and it looks a little bit like a children's playground. It's just maybe missing some slides and some ropes or something. And I had no clue what it was, but as you approach it, you start to notice that there's, and you can see it now, there are different etchings and carvings on the wood. These are elm trees, and of course, Dutch elm's disease, it killed lots of trees. Now, if we go one slide further, you see what happens, that you have to sit in one tree, and then suddenly all those trees come together. So we just go back one slide. If you go back to that, that's what climate change looks like in most schools. It just looks like a random collection of facts and figures, bits and pieces, with no synergy, no kind of coherence. They do a bit in geography, a bit in biology, and so on, but they don't have a systemic understanding of the problem. And the job, I think, of Adélaïde, Rahmina, is to bring consciousness to people so that they can see that this is a deeply systemic thing. And if we just go back to the second image, we need to show people how things fit together. How does this all link up? And we need to give it like a systems view. And I'll just give one example of that as a teacher. And that is if we think about body temperature. When schools teach about climate change and temperature, they normally talk like an extra 2 degrees. What does that mean? Well, today it will be even nicer maybe to have an extra 2 degrees. And we have a kind of a material, tactile experience of the world. But if you think about 2 degrees at a systems level, it's entirely different. So my body, if I had a fever today and I had an internal body temperature which was raised by 2 degrees, I would not be here. I would be home feeling sorry for myself. I'd feel lethargic. I would have no energy whatsoever. And that's because my biosystem functions perfectly at 37. Now, 4 degrees, which is what we're almost heading towards by the end of the century on current pathways, that's technically known as hyperpyrexia, and that's death in 24 hours. So when you take temperature, instead of thinking about it as an individual event, and you start to think systemically, then you start to see that this is a very, very serious fundamental problem, and we're facing the breakdown of major global organs, be that the Amazon rainforest, be that Lake Victoria, or whatever. And we're heading towards a full systems collapse. So to be confronted by that truth for myself in 2011 and be amongst students the day after who basically were clueless about the whole situation, apart from ideas of recycling and plastic waste and so on, that was a major existential shock for myself. So that's what, I suppose, what combines the three of us, although I'm an older generation, in a way, through activism and through our projects, we're trying to bring people to sit in this seat, this one place where you see where the synergies are. So that's, in a way, what this session, I think, is about trying to bring things, our consciousness, our awareness of things into sharp focus. So there were challenges in that. So maybe, Rahmina, could you talk about the challenges of when you try to communicate these things, these impacts? What did you come up against?
Pardon?
When you try to communicate about the climate crisis or about the crisis in Lake Victoria, what issues, what conflicts did you have to overcome? What barriers?
I mean, from the Lake Victoria community, a lot of us really consider ourselves as people who are warriors, we are fighters. So we don't really take into consideration about giving up for the fight for a better planet. Because you know what my grandmother used to tell me was like when she was walking along the road, in the past she used to see sitatunga, that is the impalas. But nowadays you can rarely even see one. And I used to enjoy as a kid looking at the fish jumping outside the lake into the water and all that, but right now it's more of just a history. It's not there, it's no longer there. And I really think communication is really key, most especially using online advocacy, online platforms where you could channel in different informations about the ecosystems, how they're being affected, by the climate crisis and also by pollution. Like for instance, what you're doing in Lake Victoria is basically what's needed to be done for the water ecosystems. For example, cleanups for the pollution, reducing pollution in the Lake Victoria, creating sustainability, innovative type of way that we could be able to integrate climate action and economy. Like for example, if you may please rise like the products that are next to you. So these are some of the products that we make, the hyacinth, that we're trying to bring into the communities to use the invasive species, that is water hyacinth. We've tried creating more employment for the youths and women. The reason as to why we're targeting women is because of, since there's the effects of the climate change and also the decline in fish because of pollution and water hyacinth, they have been subjected into things such as selling their own body for fish. You can imagine as a woman degrading your own self just to get fish at the end of the day for your family. And it's so depressing, and you can imagine what even the young girls face. They have to sell their body to get even, let's say, food and money, and that's not how we're trying to elevate the females. So we're trying to create a possible way that they could have an alternative towards even getting money at the end of the time. Like using these products for hyacinth to make other things and getting a revenue is one of the sources of making an innovative and eco-friendly way of living. For us, hyacinth is a big problem. It chokes the fish, it blocks the water transport systems, and it's really a huge menace right now, since because of the high temperatures, it's really growing. And for us as a society, we really believe that we can usually use our own waste to make something out of it. I normally speak at these conferences, but when I get back home, like there's nothing to eat, there's nothing to really take me to school. And it's so sad that most of us climate activists from the MAPA regions, which is the global south, we get to have our voices to be represented in such high conferences. But when you go back home, you cannot even take 3 meals in a day, you know, as a normal human being. We cannot even afford going to school. Like right now, it's been 1 year since I went to high school. So if you're speaking about elevating climate education, then it's not necessarily there. We've had inflation in our country. We were lied to about in the manifesto that the highest standards of living won't be there and everything will be affordable. But right now, it's such a bummer, you know, giving on this trust to the leaders, calling upon them to change, but yet they don't make any differences. And with us as people from the MAPA, we really feel like our voices are being depleted. We might come to such high-level discussions, speak about the youth representation, speak about the regions that have struggling economies and how we can elevate them, enhance more projects such as technology, but yet after that, there's nothing being done. Like, I remember you speaking about COP27 and we had a discussion, and it was so sad that people, especially the youths, they came to the Children Youth Pavilion, which is the first ever Children Youth Pavilion, and they were just sitting, no engagement. Some didn't even take food. Some didn't even have money to return back to their houses, you know, from the conference. So whenever we speak about having youth representation, we should also look at how diverse it is. What is next? What's the next steps? Having policy to be implemented, and even having more societies to come up and elevate the local grassroots initiatives. Like when you speak about actions, normally people speak about the international way, you know, having policies, drafting interventions, having high-level discussions, but don't look at what the local grassroots are doing. So if you could try, like each and every one of you, to even donate $2 or even €2 to the people from the communities who are doing cleanups, it would really elevate a lot of people. And poverty will not be there, will not be crying. There's poverty, there's existential unemployment rates. Many youths will come up, even the older people, and they'll say that, oh, if protecting the planet will make me to survive and have, like, you know, money to take my kid to the school, then why not do it? So it's something that is really revolutionary. And I really recommend us all coming together, promoting intersectionality, because it's really important. Let not our regions define who we are.
And I think on the sofa we have, if we just peel it down into basic facts, Belgium needs to cut its emissions by 20% per year from now in order to avoid 2 degrees warming. 1.5 is already cooked. So Belgium needs to do that level of radical change, and these numbers which I give you come from Cut X%. It's a website which is endorsed by the world's most eminent scientists. And Kenya, by contrast, is 1%. So there's a global imbalance in terms of emissions and in terms of those who consume and those who suffer. And just to zoom in on one angle that you've just raised, is that not only are those who are emitting the least suffering the most, but there's a gender thing going on as well. Like, Rahmina, you've just explained how it is to be made a climate refugee and to be displaced. Well, women, when they're displaced and have to fight to survive, it's much tougher. So there's that. And so maybe you can add to that.
I want to come in the idea of the responsibility that we would have more as if we can frame it towards global north, towards activists and people from MAPA, which are most affected people and areas. The reason why I think we actually have a bigger responsibility to stand up, to mobilize, to organize, is because of our historical responsibility of obviously the way we have decided to develop has emitted way more CO2, has contributed massively to climate change. We have gone and taken resources from different countries who are now suffering from climate change. That brings us a historical responsibility. And then today, still, more privileged people with a higher economical income, will release more emissions. So obviously, we don't have the same responsibility, not only as individuals, but also as states. So that means that here in Belgium, in the EU, in the West in general, we have this responsibility that forces us to organize ourselves, to then react faster to first reducing, of course, the source of climate change, which is reducing the emissions, but also looking at our history and what that means. And that comes in conversation, negotiations, also at COPs, for example, but we have to go much further. And in order to make sure that we are actually, for example, aligned to the Paris Agreement and that we are actually aligning to the standards that are needed for people who are living the consequences of climate change, we have to listen to people like Rahmina. We have to listen to you. We have to listen to these activists and these people because they are the ones who know. And so I think our role here as a global movement, because we are part of a global young climate movement, is that here in the West, we make sure to pass the message that needs to be passed from MAPA activists. And we make sure that this message is passed here because most of the demands actually have to be implemented in the West, because of that responsibility. And so this collaboration, this coordination that we have created in young movements, this is what is expected from the international community, because this is what is needed if we really want to face it. And then that means that concretely, on the ground, it's in these countries that we have to be perfect. And right now we're not. I'm listening to Macron, Alexander De Croo, our leaders who are asking for a break on climate regulations. This is really a joke because it's about people's life. It's really about people's life. And maybe it's it's something that looks like far away for us because we are slowly starting to see some consequences. But we have to remember that it is a privilege to not see the consequences of climate change. It's a privilege to talk about climate change in the future tense. And I think we have to always, every day, remember that privilege. And that's when I realized that I had this privilege, it forced me to become an activist.
And let's have some questions from the audience, if there are any. In a way, yes, thank you. Do you want to come to the... In a way, it's a bit disproportionate in that we're just talking here about the problems and we haven't done solutions yet. But I think that's in a way the state that we're in. We're still having to talk about the systemic threat, but yeah.
Thank you so much for both of your participation. Rahmina, the points that you brought up in regard to women being disproportionately affected by climate change is something that's so important. My main question is around data collection for climate change. Unfortunately, sometimes it's quite difficult to measure impact, and really for us to make a change, we have to make sure that policymakers and people like us in the room have the correct type of data to be able to make informed decisions. So do you have any opinion on impact measurement for climate change, or even are there any data points that you feel like you haven't been able to share yet? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. If I can put X% back on the table, you can Google it. In fact, Jasper, who's in the audience, he's a Climate Academy student. He built an app for a phone. You can download that too, and that's got all the data as well. So well done, Jasper. And I think this CUT-X index is the simplest and most direct way to answer that question, because if you think about the EU's policy commitment or America's policy commitment, they always give commitments of a certain percentage by a certain year based on a certain date in history, 1990 typically. Now, if I gave my students a report in which I said, hey, Jimmy, I think you're going to get 40% extra grades by the year 2027 based on your results in 2001, the parents would protest. I mean, what kind of a report is that? So we don't have ask if we have all of these dashboards for COVID, we have data like this, but we don't have a climate index. Why do we not have a climate index? And just that one question exposes all kinds of system-level problems that we have with this. We're all only in individual action mode, and we're not in system-level thinking mode. I don't know, I can feel time is, we have 5 minutes. Yeah, are there other questions? Yeah. Sorry, I took that question.
Thank you very much for your interventions, and thank you very much for your incredible work. It's inspiring to see young people, at the front of social change. So my question is trying to maybe frame what you've been talking about in the wider context of security and NATO. Where do you see the role of international security-oriented organizations? When it comes to climate and environmentally related human security, and I'm thinking about adaptation, I'm thinking about human mobility, these kind of issues that I think politically we're struggling to address effectively.
Adélaïde?
Yeah, if I can comment on that, the climate crisis consequences leads and will lead to more and more tensions between groups, between the way we're going to live, because all of this and climate change is also linked to resources. And so actually at the end of the day, climate change is just kind of the first phase that we are looking at, but behind it, when you open the door, there is a much more structural tension, conflicts that are present, and that is present, on an international level. And that's what I meant by historical responsibility. We need to talk about it if we want to talk about climate change. Otherwise, you will not erase the real tensions that are present. You will have maybe negative peace, but you will not actually have the positive peace that erases completely the tensions that are present. And so I think the responsibility, for example, of NATO and our international community is to make sure that we look at it on a structural way. This means intersectionality. Just look at today. We cannot have a panel in the morning about space without talking about its consequences on humans, on climate change, on resources. And then in the next panel, we also need to include that. And today, on this panel, we have to include this intersectional vision on what climate change has impacts on security, etc. So also one thing that I think NATO, for example, should work on is not only the consequences of climate change, but the source. The actual fact that today there are millions of people rising up across the entire world because they feel insecure, because of the way we still decide to organize ourselves, because it's not secured. We continue to fuel climate emergency. And so we need to talk about the fueling of a crisis that has consequences. So I think that's the role of international coordination such as NATO. You want to add something?
I think the gentleman can just go before the time.
Thank you so much for being here. Just brief question.
Okay.
You mentioned privilege, that is a very important word when we speak about these things. Basically, I don't know, in your experience, in your countries, in your different realities, do you think that this climate education is for a privileged group, unfortunately, because that's also true. Sometimes we speak about climate education, but everybody has the access to it. Thank you.
I think we have to wrap up, and I'll take on that job. I've got 20 seconds. So I think that's a nice question to finish in the way that every school has history as a subject, but we don't have future as a subject. And that's a huge blind spot. And so, yes, globally, we need to put that right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're finished.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was such a fascinating panel discussion, really powerful to hear those personal stories and perspectives on climate change. We learned from that discussion a lot of things, but among other things, we learned that climate change requires resilience in many areas.